Welcome to part 3 of my onion growing series, where I'm going to show you how we prep and harvest and cure and store our big beautiful onions until the next growing season when we have fresh onions again and we never have to buy onions from the store. And of course, everything we've done up until now has also been important, from choosing the right varieties that are known to store well, starting them from seed instead of sets, and making sure they grow big and beautiful. And if you missed any of those details, you can find them all on parts 1 and 2 here on my channel, and I'll link them in the video description below. Here we are, it's August in my Wisconsin Zone 4 garden, and the onions are starting to tell me they're thinking about being ready for harvest. We've kept them watered all summer, we've kept them pretty weeded, and they're in their final stretch. And I can tell that because they're starting to flop over. That is the only indicator you need to look at to know when the onions are getting ready for harvest. You can see most of them are still standing up straight, but the first ones have started to flop over. This act of the onions flopping over is really, really important, especially if you want to store your onions long term. This bending of the neck is signaling to the onion that it is done growing and that the bulb should start to prepare for storage and for dormancy. So we want to make sure we let them do that and we honor their natural process. Now, after they've flopped over, they will sit in the garden for about 2 weeks before they're actually harvested. And in that time, the necks will get really, really limp. There are 2 main roads you can take when harvesting onions, either a big bulk batch harvest or a slow harvest. And your specific situation will determine which road you'll want to take. The onions will tend to flop over in waves, which means they're ready to harvest in waves unless you help them out. So once about 50% are flopped over, you can go through and flop over the rest. This will cause all of your onions to be ready to harvest about at the same time, and you can just go right down the row and pick them all. And of course, there are some trade-offs here. While it is really nice to be able to get this harvest done all at once, any onion that you flop over before it naturally flopped over means that you're cutting it off from reaching its full potential. It probably would have grown a little bit bigger. So you have to decide here, do you want convenience or do you want onions that are a little bit bigger? And I actually don't prefer this method. I like to do a slow harvest instead, which I'll show you next. But there are situations where I think this type of harvesting can be really useful. Like if you're somebody who likes simplicity, or maybe you just don't have a lot of time to dedicate to your garden, or maybe you're somebody who doesn't live near your garden and can't visit it very often, or perhaps you're going on vacation and you need to get this harvest over before you leave. Okay, now for the slow harvesting method, which is definitely more my style, probably because it's a little bit fussier. It's also the most natural way to harvest onions, and I think it feels like working with nature rather than against it. And for this method, you simply let the onions tip over whenever they're going to tip over. You don't tip them over, you let Mother Nature run its course. So it's a little bit easier in that you kind of just let it happen, but the fussy part comes in because you need to be checking the onions every couple days. And because the onions are flopping over willy-nilly whenever they want and randomly, and you'll never be able to remember who flopped over when, and you're not relying on a calendar of, 2 weeks since this row flopped over or since I flopped it over, you have to look to their necks and feel their necks to know when they're ready to actually pick. Definitely don't be intimidated by this. It's actually really easy to tell when an onion is ready to be picked. It's just that it takes a little bit more diligence. We typically come out, I would say about every 3 days or so, we try to get out in the garden with a bucket and pick whatever onions need picking. And you can see here, Carl's just going through and simply feeling the necks of the onions to know which ones are ready. And here's what we're looking for. This one on the right, very stiff and firm, not ready. This one in the middle though, very limp and floppy. That is one that's ready to pick. This one on the left, not quite ready yet. It's a lot easier to feel in person than it is to see in a video. So once you get out there in your onion patch and start feeling the necks, you will definitely be able to tell. You'll feel that floppiness. Any onions that aren't ready to be picked, we just leave right out there in the garden and then check them again the next time we're out there in a few more days. The next step after harvesting the onions is to cure them, and that's just a fancy word for drying them. The requirements for this is that it should be somewhere out of the elements, so not in direct sun and not subject to rain, and it needs to be somewhere breezy with good airflow. You also need to have a way to separate the onions. They can't just be in one big pile. And for that, we use 2 hog panels, one inverted on top of the other, which ends up making the absolute perfect size slots to hang onions down from, and then we just suspend them between two sawhorses. And from there, it's pretty easy. Every time we harvest a bucket of onions, we just bring them back to our covered porch here, and Carl stuffs the greens down into the slots so that the onions are hanging and kind of dangling there. And you can see that they have a lot of airflow around them. They're nice and evenly spaced out, and the greens have a lot of room to dry so that they'll dry pretty quickly. And we'll leave these right here until they're fully dry. And how long that takes, I think, depends a lot on where you live and your environment. Here in Wisconsin, it's fairly humid during the summer, and these typically take for me at least 3 weeks up to a month to dry. I always have a few onions that are just a little too small to fit in the slots, and for those I keep a wire basket just out on the onion rack, and I'll put them in it and kind of drape the greens right over the side. Aren't they just beautiful? I can't think of another crop that is more satisfying to grow and harvest than onions. Well, it's been about a month since we started harvesting the onions, and you can see these ones over on the left here that we harvested first are totally dry and looking great. And because we're using the slow harvesting method this year and picking the onions as they're naturally ready, you can see there's a pretty big gradient of dryness here, with some being totally dry and some being not dry at all. And that's fine, but it is something that I want to pay attention to. When I have onions that are totally dry, I want to get them in the house as soon as I can after that. So what I'm looking for here is for the stem to feel very dry and very thin and very papery. I don't want to feel any moisture or any suppleness or any kind of bulk in that onion neck. This is important because the next step is going to be to cut the greens off. And if there's any moisture at all left in the neck, like on this other one over here, you can see that there's a little bit of yellow in there. If there's any moisture, that can breed bacteria, and that bacteria can cause your onion to spoil. One thing you might run into is an onion that refuses to dry. It'll be mostly dry, but will have a central stalk that remains green. And these are not great candidates for long-term storage just because they have so much moisture still in the neck. And I find that this happens. It tends to happen more if you don't make sure the onion is flopped over or you pick it before the neck is really, really limp. So once your onions are fully dry, and don't worry, you will definitely get the hang of telling when, it's time to prep them for storage, which basically involves cleaning them up a little bit. I like to take a scissors and trim the roots, just give them a little bit of a haircut, then flip it over and cut off the greens, and I like to leave an inch or two of length there. And then I like to try to rub as much dirt off of them as possible, just because I don't want to bring a lot of dirt into my house. And whether or not to remove the outer layer of paper totally depends on the onion. If it's going to come off really easy, like if it's already falling off like this, I take it off, which I like because it makes the onion really beautiful. But if it's really tight and stuck on there, leave it on. You want it to have as many layers of paper as it can to help protect it. And as far as prep and as far as cleanup goes, that's pretty much it. I'm just going to keep working through these one by one. And here's another one where the skin is just begging to come off, which I always love. It is so satisfying. You'll see. As far as what to store your onions in, I really like the simplicity of cardboard boxes because they're free and they just happen to work really great. Just make sure that whatever you store them in is breathable. So a wooden or a plastic crate is a good option, or a wire mesh basket. And I know that a lot of people like to braid them and string them up and hang them, which is another great way to store them as well. One other thing I wanted to mention is that as you're going through and cleaning up your onions, do a little bit of an inspection and look for any that aren't perfect. Like this one right here has a little bit of moisture left in the stem, so I'm going to set that one aside. And take note of any that have like bruises or blemishes or cuts or nicks or anything like that, and save those to put at the top of your container. I'm going to put these at the top of the box. That way I use them first, because if any of my onions spoil, it's likely going to be these. So where should you store your onions? Well, they do have a few requirements. The number one thing being that it should be somewhere dark, because light will make them sprout sooner than later. The second thing is that they should be dry. A root cellar is actually not a great location to store onions because it's usually a little bit too humid, and that can cause the onions to mold. And the third thing to think about is temperature. You want to store them in the coolest location that you can find in your house. We actually store ours right here in this cabinet in our living room. We do keep our house pretty cool in the winter. I would say that this cabinet stays about 60 degrees, which I have found works perfectly for the onions. It's dark in here, it's dry, and it is cool enough, and the boxes keep them separated and are breathable, and I can easily find what I'm looking for. These onions will store well for me all the way to next summer, right about the time when we have decent size, harvestable, fresh onions growing in the garden, which is a really cool full circle homesteading moment. And that's it. That is how to store onions long term. As always, let me know if you have any questions. And if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you could give it a thumbs up. And make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you are the first to know whenever a new video is posted.